Moving on to section 1.2. Does anyone have any questions thus far? Awesome. Okay, so in about the 16th century, or okay, well, starting in the 16th century, with their conquest, the Spanish are later able to create around 11 major cities, um, tons of impressive universities, hundreds of religious sites, churches, cathedrals, missions. Um, that's just anecdotal that our book mentions, and I assumed would be important to include because it provides contrast between where they started and where they went afterwards. Moving onwards, we're going to talk about economic systems. Um, they start in the, I'm sorry guys, I didn't take Spanish class in middle school. I took Latin, so I'm going to say it wrong probably, but they start with the encomienda system, which is based entirely out of forced labor. It is essentially slavery. Um, it was very forcibly enacted by colonial rulers. There was intense legal control, and ultimately it leads to more mass suffering for African slaves and Native Americans under Spanish rule. And this is seen in roughly the 1500s. Oh, hey Renzo. So the PowerPoint is going to be posted in the Discord, just so you can access that. It's also in the stream. Okay. In the 1700s, we see Spanish colonies moving away from the encomienda system. They instead start to gravitate toward a system called the hacienda system, which is very similar to North American sharecropping, which we won't be discussing today, but I'm sure you all know what sharecropping is. We see private plantation owners who owned large swaths of land employing Native American workers, which were called peons, with very, very, very poor wages and very, very high taxes. So what that did was it essentially kept these Native American laborers in debt. And while it wasn't technically slavery, they were extremely controlling. The Native American laborers were kept in poverty and worked as like pseudo indentured servants. Um, it's very, very close to slavery. It's not much better, but our book, it refuses to call it slavery. So we're moving on to the social impact section. Due to the hacienda system, we see a distinct Spanish colonial social hierarchy emerge in around the 1600s. Um, the very top, I'm sure we all would guess this. Spanish-born male settlers sat at the top. Whether they were rich or poor, our book says, all Spanish-born males refused to do manual labor. They did not view themselves as subordinate colonials. They saw themselves as residents of essentially a Spanish kingdom. They really did treat it like they were basically living in some kingdom in Spain, which is really interesting to see them look at it that way. This can really be summed up by the idea that they're loyal to the crown, they're loyal to the king, but they still really want to do the whole self-governance thing. Um, do they get to do that? Not really. We will touch on that in a second. Moving on, descendants of the original conquistadors, they've got some issues, and their main issue is that essentially a bunch of people who are born in Spain and would therefore go at the very top of the social hierarchy are coming in and moving into South America. And for them, these American born children of the original conquistadors, this is pretty bad because now they are under someone. They are called the Creoles, not the people that they're under, but the American-born Spaniards. And they really, really did not like the Spanish-born immigrants, the Peninsulares, um, who basically just came in and were like, yeah, we're better than you. And they got to be better than them. They really did not like that. There are going to be conflicts later on, which we don't touch on yet, which will result directly from this. Another notable thing which influences culture in South America even today is that there are very few Spanish-born women. So you have a bunch of horny Spanish dudes, but like barely any Spanish women. It's like 1 to 8 at one point, 8 being the men. And the Spanish guys essentially go, well, shit, what do we do? And they decide that the Native American women should they should suffice, which it's a pretty screwed up way to think about things, but the impact is somewhat positive. It leads to a very large mixed race population who are called the mestizo. Um, many touching on the thing that we mentioned earlier, many Native American women married Spanish men to avoid the constant assault and danger of being outside a Spanish household. And because of this, mestizo population skyrockets. They become a dominant ethnic group in Mexico over a 300-year time period. And it's like over 91% was mestizo. Mestizo individuals are separated into one of 12 different castes based on their precise racial heritage and skin tone. Basically, the closer you were to being white or white passing, the higher up you were in the mestizo caste system. This is actually a theme that we see in South America quite often. Um, when we touch on mulatto populations later, especially in Brazil, we see over 40 different diverse ethnic groups arising specifically from race mixing. And this is going to contrast very strongly when we touch on it with North American interactions and racial structures. At first, mestizo individuals were viewed as inferior, and to a degree, they were not inferior. They were viewed as inferior persistently. Um, they were said to be born of improper marriages by, the hella white and nasty Spanish colonizers. But because they had such large numbers, they were later recognized as a distinct ethnic group. Um, yeah, there was a lot of there was still racism. I want to make that very clear that just because there was a lot of racial interaction and there was a lot of race mixing, it does not mean that there was not racism. There were just different kinds of racism. The only reason the mestizo population wasn't as low down as the Native Americans was because there were so many of them. Um, Racism is pretty distinctly different, not absent, but just different in South America as opposed to North America. And we're going to get into the reasons why when we talk about North America more. Um, so at the bottom of our social class system, we have the Native Americans. They were called Indians. and they were subject to immense trauma and violence. And these are people who have come out of the Great Dying and watched, shoot, I think 54 million people die out of 60 million. So we got like 4 million people left. So not only are these people traumatized, they're subject to intense violence, they're subject to constant sexual assault, and later are essentially put into slavery. They become the primary labor force in Spanish colonies for a time, and they suffer horrific, disgusting working conditions. An example is that the average lifespan of a miner in South America during the time period was 5 years. As soon as you started working in the mines, your lifespan was shortened to 5 years tops. That's how abhorrent these working conditions were. They were also required to pay large tributes, much like the Chinese tributary system, to their Spanish overlords. And this was made to keep them in poverty. It means that by some means, if they were somehow able to accumulate wealth, they would have all of that wealth immediately stripped from them via the tributary system. To escape this or to try and get some relief, many natives, having had their empires destroyed, their religions nearly wiped out by Spanish missionaries, they choose to learn Spanish, and a lot of them convert to Christianity. They move to cities to work for wages, and a lot of them lose their ways of life. We see examples eating mostly European foods, utilizing plows instead of traditional tools, and instead of solving their issues traditionally, they instead choose to take them to Spanish legal courts. There's a distinct word which can be used to describe this. Does anybody have any guesses as to what this might be? What? Okay. There's a distinct word which we can see describing what happens to Native American culture and Native Americans at this time. Do you guys have any guesses as to what it might be? Do you want me to like reread
Oh,
over that?
can it be like assimilate maybe?
Oh,
Is
it's a bit more violent than assimilation.
oh, then I don't know.
Genocide?
Genocide is used to describe the Great Dying. The Great Dying was genocide. Um, but that's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about Native American culture. The word I'm looking for is whitewashing. We see a lot of whitewashing in Native American culture at the time period because of how many people died in the Great Dying. I'm going to go back over that section with that lens of they are literally being whitewashed. Natives had their empires destroyed. Their religions were nearly wiped out by Spanish missionaries, and this leads them to choose to learn Spanish and to convert to Christianity. They move to cities to work for wages, and they lose a lot of their ways of life. They eat predominantly European food. They use plows instead of traditional tools. And instead of handling their issues traditionally, they instead choose to take them to Spanish courts. Do you guys see how that's whitewashing?
Yes.
Yeah, pretty blatant whitewashing. Because of especially their reliance on Spanish courts, we see an even further decrease in women's rights. This is because the Spanish essentially they deliberately viewed Native American women as minors, as in like they weren't considered adults. Um, which means that like in legal affairs, Native American women are treated essentially as toddlers who are incompetent and irresponsible, and therefore they lose a lot of or any authority that they had. So their rights become even more limited. However, we do have a however. Native Americans were granted some level of autonomy on the local level. We see traditional markets persist. Native American crops and foods are maintained to a degree, and women are able to hold some personal property. Damn. It's really, women's rights are really bad when the most they can say is, yeah, they were allowed to own some things. We do actually see blending, cultural blending of Christian saints and native gods, which is to me really interesting and something that I hadn't heard of before, and I might go over it more for the lecture for the hell of it, like the pre-test lecture. But like we do see some cultural diffusion from Christianity into native religions, which do persist. And it allows for native rituals and magic to survive the conquest. Okay, that's going to be the end of our Spanish conquest section. Do you guys have any questions at all? You've all got perfect understanding.
Yes.
Awesome. Moving on to section 2.0. We are going to talk about the sugar colonies. So in Brazil in the 1600s, Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, go in and make note of the fact that there are not any like huge Native American empires or whatever. There might be like a couple tribes scattered around, but this, compared to like Mesoamerica or the Andean region, is very, very sparsely populated because it's like the jungle essentially. But Europeans discovered that in the lowland areas of Brazil, and the Caribbean later on, they're very, very well suited to the production of sugar. Does anybody know there's a very specific term used to describe plants like sugar? Does anybody know what that is?
Sugarcane? What do you mean?
Cash crops?
Cash crops. Cash crops. Sugar is a cash crop, which means it is very what?
Money. It's worth lots of stuff.
It's worth lots of stuff. So Europeans learn large scale, make note of that, large scale sugar cultivation from the Arabs on the Mediterranean. They used the same techniques in the Americas, which would allow Portuguese sugar planters to dominate the global sugar market for over a century. That's 1570 to 1670. Hey guys, remember back at the start we talked about mercantilism? Can anybody explain to me how the Portuguese were acting mercantilistically?
Because they took the sugar of their colonies and sold it to other people themselves instead of letting the colonies do it.
Okay. What they did was they essentially came in and they were like, no, literally the only thing you are making, sugar. You're not growing anything else but sugar. It was so extreme that a lot of these colonies literally only existed to produce and export sugar. They were so sugar oriented that they actually only ever imported basic food items and necessities, meaning that they didn't even use their fields to produce their own food, preferring instead to use every ounce of land for profitable cash crops, which the profitable cash crop is sugar. Yeah. So the Portuguese are like, hey, colony in Brazil, go make a bunch of sugar. They have no choice but to make it. They have no choice but to give it to the Portuguese. And therefore it leads to Portuguese sugar dominance. This doesn't last though, because the British, the French, and the Dutch go to the Caribbean and they're like, oh my gosh, this is even better than what the Portuguese have in Brazil. And it also becomes huge sugar wise. Because it was so labor intensive to produce and to crystallize and all of that, and because there were so little natives that they could use to force to work on sugar plantations, they instead choose to use, anybody want to take a guess at what this increases reliance on?
The transatlantic slave trade.
The transatlantic slave trade. Basically, very few Native Americans, the native population is decimated. And Europeans are like, ew, no, I'm white. I would never, in regards to working. Reference back to the point where, or earlier in the lecture, where they basically just refuse to do anything physical. And this is very physical. This increases traffic and development on the Atlantic slave trade. And it provides a model for the Northern American reliance on slaves. Working conditions were abhorrent. Especially on sugar producing estates, working conditions were abhorrent, with many being reminded of the heat and fire in scenes of hell while they looked into the huge cauldrons used to make crystallized sugar. Paired with diseases, the working conditions, paired with diseases and working conditions, mortality rates were extremely high and life expectancy was extremely low, with 5 to 10% of all sugar producing slaves dying each year. If 5 to 10% of all of your workers die every year, what does that mean?
To new ones.
You're going to have to get new ones. So what does that mean for the transatlantic slave trade? Yeah, they constantly have to be replacing these workers because they're, treating them so inhumanely that they're just dying in mass. Yeah, it really increases reliance and expands the transatlantic slave trade. That's really what I'm trying to get at here. We're going to talk about gender for a bit. Female slaves suffered the same brutal conditions as their male counterparts, despite huge and persistent gender imbalances in the American economies. Basically, men were doing more physical work than women in South America. Despite this, female slaves made up about half of all field gangs. Field gangs were small teams of slaves who did extremely heavy labor, oriented around the planting and harvesting of sugarcane. Make note of the fact that although they were doing very heavy, intense labor, they were limited from doing skilled labor of working in like the sugar refineries. Aside from this, many female slaves did also work as servants for white women in urban areas, performing domestic chores and sex work. These are the two most notable. They worked in your houses, they cook, they clean, they do all of that, but they're also used very frequently as sex workers. Another just like sad thing that happened was they are separated from their children and were actively discouraged from having families. Make note of this. This is extremely important and becomes a stark difference as opposed to the North Americans. There was a much larger slave population in Brazil and the Caribbean than there was in Latin Latin America. Goodness, I can't talk. It's too late, man. 93% of the population consisted of slaves in the sugar colonies. There was very minimal marital race mixing. It only accounted for about 10% of marriages. However, there was a very large mixed race population. Does anybody want to take a swing as to why?
Wait, did you say swing as to why there's why this wait, can you get something mixed? Can you repeat that one more time?
Take a shot as to why there are very minimal biracial marriages in sugar colonies, but very large biracial populations.
Because oh wait, never mind. Because I was thinking that like in my view, because if you're not mixed and you're like pure white or European or like Spain or whatever, you're at the top of the system, I guess. But I guess that doesn't really count when it's the entire population. So I don't know.
No,
Right?
I'm not feeling it all the way, but I feel like you're maybe on the right track thinking about social hierarchies. What I'm trying to get at is that the sex workers, many or all of whom were of African and Native descent, led to a huge mixed race population. Because what happens if you have a lot of horny white guys?
They sex.
Babies.
Yeah, babies. And that creates a huge mixed race population with a very minimal mixed race marriage population. Just general vocabulary on this slide. Mulattoes were European African peoples. And that should really be it for that. I think we can move on to section 3.0, and then we're gonna be out of it because this is pretty minimal. Uh, the what? Damn. Okay. So the plantation complex in North America drew largely on ideas of the Caribbean system, where the British implemented a similar reliance on African slavery. However, instead of sugar, the British instructed their American colonies to produce tobacco, rice, cotton, and indigo, all of which were major cash crops. A sharp difference between North and South American colonies is that British women joined in colonial migration. So why was there such a large mixed race population in South America, aside from the sugar colonies?
Sex workers, right? And you said it like a few seconds.
No, that's
Oh,
the sugar colonies.
oh.
Okay.
The native.
Because there were so few Spanish women that went with the Spaniards when they conquered South America. So, what do you think is going to happen if there are a ton of British women who are going with the British men to conquer, or not to conquer, to colonize North America? Is there going
They
to be a very large mixed race population or not?
they don't have sex with the natives.
Yeah, they don't have sex with the natives because white people think that white people are the best thing that have ever happened ever, and therefore have sex with British women instead. Another thing to note is that in North America, native populations were already a lot smaller than they were in South America because they never urbanized. outside of like Mississippi, which our book mentions on a map and then never mentions ever again. Yeah, like just right off the bat, there weren't nearly as many natives, but then European diseases come in and they decimate the populations even further. So in European, particularly British colonies, we actually see a huge majority of white people. Like they were almost entirely European populated, which is very different from the hyper diverse um mixed race, native, Spanish populations of South America. Um, Going forwards, slavery was also pretty different in North America. North American slaves were allowed to have children with each other, which is different than what happened on the sugar the sugar colonies. Do you guys remember what happened with the sugar colonies in regards to slave families?
They don't want them having families.
Yeah, they didn't allow African women to have children. So they cut down on slave families. But in North America, what they did was they either forced them to or allowed them to. And by 1750, all North American slaves were born in the New World. So they're not coming from Africa anymore. They're now all from America. There's a little blurb about the British and the Spanish. Basically, it's like Protestants don't like Catholics. The British and the Spanish go at it. The Spanish control like an area down around Florida, and the British have essentially the scraps that's up like New England, garbage weather land. And they went back and forth and killed each other a lot until the Spaniards were like, damn, and took their Catholicism and fucked off. There is one thing that I want to touch on though. Our book uses the word verbatim clearing to describe the genocide of native populations in America, which is super sus. They say that the two main causes are disease and aggressive military policies. I don't know what aggressive military policies is, but if they're using the word clearing in the same sentence to describe a genocide, we can assume it's probably pretty bad, right?
This book
Yeah.
was funded by PragerU.
Ha! No, but the people that did write our book are like actual neoliberals, if we have any poli-sci nerds that are listening to this. Yeah. Neoliberalism is rampant in our book. That's going to be the end of our lecture. Do you guys have any questions? Renzo, are you good?
Yeah. Wait, I was gonna say I have like one question. Okay, so
Okay.
earlier you were talking about how like how people were dying from doing like farming, right? And then they had to get like a bunch of slaves, and then that expanded the Atlantic slave trade route, right? But like, what
Yeah.
were they dying from? Was it like disease or what were they dying from?
Okay, so part of it was disease. Do you get okay? Part of it was like during the Little Ice Age,
Oh
it
yeah, I
caused an
remember
increase in rainfall
that.
in tropical areas, which stimulated yellow fever outbreaks. Well, those yellow fever outbreaks were predominantly in slaves.
Got it.
Another thing is that they literally treated them so poorly, the working conditions were so bad that they just died so
Oh,
much. They died really quickly. They're treated like livestock.
ooh, that's
Um Like the sugar refinery process is made up of a couple steps. You had to go out into the fields and plant it all and harvest it, which was back-breaking, soul-crushing labor. But then you had to essentially take the sugar cane and throw it into a huge vat and just cook the shit out of it. And then you had to crystallize it, which means you also now have. Has anyone ever gotten hot sugar on them and it's burned them?
No.
Okay, well, being burned by molten sugar is probably one of the most painful burns you can receive. They were getting stuff like that on a daily basis. All it took was like one slip up, and keep in mind these are people that are not being fed consistently. They're not sleeping consistently. They're overworked. They're malnourished. So they're not in physical condition to work optimally, which means accidents become rampant.
Mm-hmm.
Like one slip up means that someone's covered in molten sugar, and that will kill you.
Ooh.
So abuse was so rampant and the working conditions were so bad that it led to a lot of people just dying. 5 to 10%. And keep in mind, their population, like 93% of the population of the sugar colonies were African slaves. 10% of them died every year because of how bad the working conditions were. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Dope. Okay, that's posted in the teams, and it's also posted in the thingy. I think that should be it, unless you guys have any other questions. Awesome.
I don't have any but
Alright, then.
Charles.